I like X-Men First Class a lot. At one time, I called it my favorite X-Men movie. I'm not sure if it still holds that distinction for me, but I still love it. It has an energy to it that none of the X-Men movies before or since have been able to match, and I will always be disappointed Matthew Vaughn didn't swoop in and save the X-Men movie sooner when he was given the opportunity with X-Men The Last Stand, or that he didn't stick with the franchise longer after he did X-Men First Class. But even when I first saw this movie, there were some things I thought could have been improved, so that's what I'm going to try and do in this video. You've been here before, you know what I'm about. But if you don't know, my version of this movie will reflect changes I did in my fixed videos of the previous X-Men movies, so keep that in mind. The first thing I would change is the name of the movie. With the conclusion of the X-Men trilogy with The Last Stand, the plan was to end that story and continue the franchise with a series of standalone spin-off movies, starting with X-Men Origins Wolverine. Following that, we were going to get X-Men Origins Magneto. There was even a screenplay written by Sheldon Turner, who got a story by credit in X-Men First Class because the produced movie had a few similar elements to his screenplay, mostly that Charles and Eric meet for the first time, though in completely different circumstances, and Eric hunts Nazis in First Class and the Origin screenplay. I haven't seen any official reason why the studio decided to ditch the Origin series, but I assume it was because of less than positive reaction to X-Men Origins Wolverine. But in my hubris, my hypothetical X-Men Origins Wolverine would have been awesome, and the studio would have had no need to scramble and change their plans at the last minute. This would be a huge change, but I would continue the standalone Origin series and make this X-Men Origins Magneto. On paper, there's still a lot of stuff I would be keeping from X-Men First Class and from Turner's screenplay that would make it into my fix, but there's also a lot that would be taken out of the First Class movie, both to focus more on Magneto and because some of the plot pieces and characters used in this movie don't work if I want to fit this in the existing X-Men movie universe. And that's a good segue into something else I would do differently, and that is to make sure this movie fits more in line with the established timeline of the previous movies. You may remember that when this movie came out, nobody could agree if it was a prequel or a reboot. There are things in this movie that heavily reference or call back to the original trilogy, but then you've also got many things that contradict those movies. Apparently, the people who worked on the movie couldn't figure out if this was a prequel or a reboot either. This thing from Internet Movie Database calls it a prequel and a reboot in the same paragraph. Screenwriter Jane Goldman considered this movie an alternate history of the previous X-Men films, while director Matthew Vaughn said he wanted to make a good film that could stand on its own 2 feet regardless of all of the other films. And I respect that. I'd rather have a good film that has some serious breaches in continuity than a mediocre or horrible film that fits in the established canon. But I think you could make a good movie that does fit in the established canon. Do a movie that is compelling on its own, that isn't confusing to people who haven't been keeping up with the X-Men movies for the past 11 years, but is also a treat to people who have been. I think it can be done. X-Men First Class, while I enjoyed it on its own, is problematic when taken as part of the X-Men franchise. While X-Men Origins Wolverine did have a few moments, I think First Class really started the trend that the next 8 years of X-Men movies would set by ignoring past movies and elements of those movies. Well, some of the previous movies have already made such a mess of things, there's no way we can fix it, so why bother? Let's just make things worse. So while it is an incredibly vague suggestion, one of the things I would set out to fix would be all the weird that doesn't fit moments in this movie and all the ones following this one. The next thing I would change would be the name of the villain. I've been saying this ever since First Class came out. The guy we get in this movie, Sebastian Shaw, is seemingly immortal and does human experimentation and was connected to the Holocaust. You know who we have in the X-Men comics who is seemingly immortal and does human experimentation and is connected to the Holocaust? Mr. Sinister. And if you feel like this movie is too self-important to have a bad guy calling himself Mr. Sinister, then just call him Nathaniel Essex. It felt like they wrote this movie with Mr. Sinister as the bad guy anyway, then changed his name at the last minute. This would make Magneto's motivations make much more sense overall. You know how people get mad at the Tim Burton Batman movie because the Joker killed Bruce Wayne's parents? Making a mutant be the source of Magneto's rage for most of this movie is like that, but much worse. Magneto hates humans. That's his thing. There's a conversation between Charles and Eric where Eric says Charles thinks all humans are nice like Moria, and Charles says Eric thinks that all humans are like Shaw. But that conversation doesn't work because Shaw is a mutant, but Mr. Sinister is not. He's a human who has been augmented. In the comics, it was Apocalypse who made him immortal, but we won't be going in that direction here. But we will be going in the direction of Essex being an altered human, so we can keep Magneto's motivations against humans nice and neat. Next, I would change Mr. Sinishaw's plan to escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis so that the whole world is covered in nuclear radiation and more mutants will be born. This is incredibly silly, right? I thought this was stupid when I first watched the movie, and in the years since it came out, I don't think I've seen a single person call this out for how stupid it is. Nuclear radiation radiation is a cause for mutation in the comics. Beast, Sunfire, Professor Xavier maybe, those guys had parents who were hit by various levels of radiation that caused mutations in their offspring. So on paper, if you don't think about it too much, a megalomaniacal mutant like Mr. Shonister wanting to create more mutants with radiation makes sense. Except that most mutants are going to die when a literal nuclear war consumes the entire planet. Mutation might increase in the offspring of the less than 10% of humanity that survives this, but almost all of the mutants who are on the planet right now are almost certainly going to die. While I don't know for certain, I think someone may have said, what if we tried connecting the plot of the movie to a historical event? They did that with the Holocaust in the first movie, they half-butted it in X-Men Origins Wolverine with 3 Mile Island, so what if we did the Cuban Missile Crisis? And then Vaughn and Goldman may have said, okay, how and why did the bad guys want to escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis? And then it feels like they came up with a filler answer to that question so that they would come back to it later, and they never did. Some of the things I like from First Class that I would want to keep in this version would be the James Bondy feeling of the action scenes in this movie, which is something Vaughn definitely brings to the table. One of my favorite aspects of this movie was that it wasn't a Wolverine movie with the other X-Men thrown in. It put the conflict and friendship between Charles and Eric at the center and built a movie around that. I would still want my version to have the same core, just with a different story built around it. We will repeat the scene that opened the first X-Men movie, with the 12-year-old Eric Winsher and his parents being taken to Auschwitz in 1944. His powers manifest as he is separated from his parents, you know the drill. Meanwhile, in America, also in 1944, we will see well-renowned scientist Brian Xavier, who has mysteriously died. This is what triggers the mutant powers of his young son, Charles Xavier. Next, we will jump forward to 1949. Remember in the first movie when Xavier told Logan he first met Eric when he was 17? It's been a few years since the war ended. Eric is trying to build a life in Israel, but he's still very angry, unable to let go of the past. He runs into Nathaniel Essex, and he's happy to see the guy. We will find out just a few months before the war ended, Essex snuck Eric out of Auschwitz. He played himself as sort of an Oscar Schindler type, but of course you and I know he is up to something sinister. Essex tells Eric there's a facility in America he would like to take him to, where others plagued by their own demons are being treated for special help. After some deliberation, Eric is convinced, and Essex takes him to America. Here is where Eric can see the Statue of Liberty for the first time because continuity. They go to a special facility that will be very similar to the Black Womb project from the comics. Black Womb was basically a bunch of mad scientists experimenting on mutants with no real objective in mind that I can tell. I think some of the best X-Men movies deal with the humans versus mutants thing, so instead of trying to eliminate or control mutants, which we have seen in my fixes for the previous movies with the Weapon X program and the Friends of Humanity, the members of Black Womb are trying to pass the traits of mutants onto themselves, like the U-Men from Grant Morrison's New X-Men, but there won't be a religion based around this, or the goofy scuba costumes. And the official name will be something other than Black Womb because that sounds terrifying, and the advertised goal of this place is to help the patients. In addition to Nathaniel Essex, some of the other staff here will be the people who are part of Black Womb in the comics. Irene Adler, who we may have to change her name to something else so people don't immediately think Sherlock Holmes when they hear her name. Amanda Mueller, and Kurt Marko, Charles Xavier's stepfather. One of them, either Irene or Mueller, will be the very heavy air quotes psychiatrist since they are playing this place off as a place to heal your spirit, but that's just a cover for their real work. Eric will meet a pretty heavily medicated Charles, and it's not an instant friendship like you see in most of the versions where they first meet. I also don't want Charles to be some kind of prodigy with his powers. He's still struggling with hearing voices, which by now he knows do not originate from his brain, but belong to everyone around him, so he's distanced himself from everyone else. Unlike the Xavier we've seen so far, this guy does not exude hope for mankind and for the future. If anything will prove to be a common ground between Eric and Charles at first, it's that they're both kind of mad at the world. Eric for obvious reasons, and Charles because he's heard stuff people around him didn't want him to hear that made him distrust them. He knows Kurt Marko was somehow involved in the death of his father when he was a kid, but when he tried to report this to the police, he had no proof, so he was forced to allow Marko to run free. In fact, unlike Eric and many of the other patients here, Charles is here against his will, and is probably Marko who is doping him up so that he can't hear their thoughts as easily. Charles also knows that Essex is evil, more than Marko even, and when he sees Eric is friends with Essex, Charles tries to warn him, but Eric won't hear anything of it. Essex saved him from torture and certain death during the war. There is no way he is the villain Charles makes him out to be. The big difference from Turner's Magneto origin screenplay and X-Men First Class is which characters they choose to have go through the journey. Turner's screenplay takes his time turning Eric into something closer to the Magneto that we see in the original trilogy, while it already has Charles as being pretty much exactly like we see him in the original trilogy, just a counselor and mentor to the victims of the war instead of mutants. While X-Men First Class takes its time getting Charles to the place we see him in the original trilogy, though his journey isn't quite as extreme as the journey Eric still has to go through once you've gotten to the end of the Magneto origin screenplay. In First Class, Charles is a shameless flirt, he parties hard, he's a man of action. There is a core to him that is consistent with the older Xavier we already know, but we spend the movie chipping away at the exterior to get there. And when we first see an adult Magneto in X-Men First Class, he's more or less already the Magneto we know from the original trilogy. He's hunting and killing his enemies for what he sees as a just reason, much like he would do in the original trilogy, like when he plans to exterminate all of humanity for the sake of mutants in X2. All that changes is his targets. I would like to do the best of both worlds, show both Charles and Eric as very different people when we first meet them at the beginning of the movie, and show that while they're not fully transitioned into the men that we know them as in the original trilogy, they are a little closer to the original trilogy by the end of this movie. Let me reiterate, they are not fully transitioned into the men we know them as in the original trilogy. I think the biggest mistake X-Men First Class made was completing Eric's transformation into Magneto. I know they had already started taking a dump on the established continuity of the previous films, but to hear Charles and Eric talk about their bromance in those movies, you would think they were friends for years, maybe even a couple of decades, before they went their separate ways. But in First Class, they know each other for about 2 weeks. They could have made an entire trilogy out of Charles and Eric slowly becoming the men we saw them as in the original trilogy, which I guess they kind of tried to do that since they were doing the friend-enemy dance with Magneto in the sequels. But by then, the moments passed and I stopped caring. But I can see why they did this. A movie generally has to have some moment of change for your main character, and since Xavier, by this point in the movie, is basically already set in his character mold that we see him in from the original trilogy, we have to have a moment of change for some other character. So we go to Eric becoming Magneto. I think you can still do a noticeable arc for both of our protagonists, but it would need to be a little bit more gradual and subtle than what First Class gave us. At the facility, we will see other patients, but they are not mutants. The scientists know for sure that Charles and Eric are mutants, and they are secretly running tests on their blood work versus the blood work from a baseline human, and seeing if they can isolate what causes the mutation so they can move forward with their plans. We will get some creepy stuck in a mad science lab stuff in the first act as Eric slowly begins to suspect that Charles may be onto something. Their therapy sessions don't seem to be going anywhere, and Eric has even noticed sometimes the therapist will suggest something completely counter to what she may have suggested a week earlier. What really tips off Eric that things aren't quite right is when Charles tries to make a break for it and is forcefully captured and brought back in. Eric is the only one who saw this, and none of the staff even know that he did see it. One night, Eric hears some shouting from the staff wing of the building, and he goes to investigate. There's some disagreement about where they should take their research. Essex believes he has the key to introducing mutations in a baseline human, but some of the others believe that he has gone too far, and this is still too dangerous to test on them. Eric will hear the scientists mention the mutant patients, which clues Eric in that he's not alone with his special gifts. And Eric is surprised to hear Essex say something about Eric's mutation. Eric had never told anyone about his mutation, not even Essex. We will find out Essex wasn't some rogue low-level scientist who snuck many patients out of the camp like he led Eric to believe. He was running the place, and knew about Eric's initial burst of powers from day one, and the only reason he saved Eric was to study him when it became clear that he was on the losing side of the war. This will set Eric off in a rage, and his powers will start going crazy. But this isn't a Magneto who is in control of his abilities yet, so while he's trying to get to Essex, something floating around the room will get in his way, and Essex and everyone else will escape. The facility is pretty much done. All of the scientists have gone into hiding because they're not sure if Eric will come after them, but Eric is only concerned with finding Essex. Charles, who is the only patient who didn't run for his life when Eric's powers went off, will try to talk to Eric, but Eric can barely hear him because he's so focused on finding the man responsible for the hell that he went through in Auschwitz. Charles will finally reach out with his mind to calm Eric, and this will be the birth of the bromance. They have something in common, and more importantly, they think they might be able to help each other. Eric wants revenge, and Charles wants to put a stop to whatever mad science Essex is planning that he gleaned from Eric's mind when they mind melded. The rest of the movie will be like When Harry Met Sally, but as an action movie, taking place over the span of a decade as we get to see these guys become good friends, and we will watch their different approach to their mission. Hopefully this way you can still use James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender, just do some movie magic to make them look younger during the mad science lab stuff. I don't know if people would buy them as 17 in 2011, but look at something like Batman Begins, where just combing Christian Bale's hair down makes him look significantly younger. So if you do something like that, get rid of the scruff on Fassbender's face, I think you can make them work as younger men and then slowly age them over the course of the movie. Even with Charles's telepathy, they're having a lot of trouble tracking Essex down, so their next best bet is to try to flush him out by tracking down any of his possible allies from the war, the Nazi war criminals still on the loose. What I liked about Turner's Magneto origin screenplay spending so much time on Eric hunting the Nazis is that he actually tries to play by the rules. He finds a Nazi hiding in France, he alerts the police, and they choose to do nothing. So he kidnaps his target and brings him to the embassy for them to deal with, and they choose to do nothing. This kind of thing will make Magneto's actions in the present day make a lot more sense. He's extreme because he has to be, since nobody else will take the necessary actions. The thing I would be doing a little different would be that Xavier is traveling with Eric during this time period, which is something we've never really had in any form that I'm aware of. The Magneto origin screenplay doesn't bring Xavier in until the last half hour of the movie or less, and I think he needs to be more prevalent in the formative years of Magneto's life, which First Class got a little closer to the mark. We will see some fun uses of their powers where they might be stealing dossiers from the police to find who they're looking for while helping each other control their abilities. I love the scene in First Class where Charles helps Eric find the balance between serenity and rage. I would want to do something like that here, but Eric will also be helping Charles to hone his own abilities. As we get through this portion of the movie, Charles will become more and more distracted from their mission, seeing people across Europe who need help and seeing that nobody is willing to help them. Even now, Charles is starting to change. He started off selfish, only caring about injustices done to him and his family, but now he begins to see what he once saw as a curse isn't that at all. It's a gift, and not even a gift for him, but for the people he can help with it. Eric won't be having full-blown philosophical debates with Charles at this point, but he will be all, come on, these Nazis aren't going to hunt themselves. Most of our second act will take place over a few years, with hunting Nazis by the book, and Charles and Eric becoming good friends, even as we will begin to see their worldviews are not compatible. Charles wants to heal and build to make sure that what happened before will not happen again. Eric believes the only way that can be ensured is to fight. And sure, Charles clearly believes a little fighting is necessary since he does train child soldiers to do his bidding, but he wants to try things diplomatically first. And even here, we will see Xavier is willing to throw a punch. There's a bar fight Xavier and Eric get into in the Turner origin screenplay I am 100% sure was taken from the Legion Quest comic book storyline of the 1990s, where they are protecting a crippled man being bullied. I'd love to see something like that, so that they're not always at odds. We will see that they do have enough in common beyond their powers that they become friends in the first place. This will be where you get Xavier as a shameless flirt, since even in the comics, Xavier got some major tail in his day. Here we can have a conversation after one of their more harrowing successes where Eric says it would be easier if they just killed these men. Charles might think that he's joking, but Eric says these men deserve it for what they have done, and since nobody else seems all that interested in hunting them down, yes, there were real-life Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, but Eric is talking about how these guys specifically have had it pretty easy for so long, with nobody raising a hand to do anything about it. Charles will say that building anything is not going to be easy, but when you are finished with what you are building, it is worth the hard road that was taken. I don't know, I'm not good at the wise scholarly dialogue that Xavier would spout off. After a few years of bringing many Nazis to justice, Eric is frustrated that they still haven't found Essex. Around this time, Charles will get a telegram from Kurt Marko. Charles hasn't spoken to him since he and Eric escaped from the facility, but the message says he has information about Nathaniel Essex. Eric is skeptical, but Charles says since they are at a dead end, it couldn't hurt for them to go talk to him. They go. We will see this is the future X-Mansion. Eric hangs back and lets Charles do the talking. For all his personal growth, Charles still holds a lot of anger towards Marko, and Marko knows this. We will find out Kurt's son, Charles' stepbrother, died in the Korean War. Charles manages a brusque sorry for your loss, but it's clear he liked his stepbrother about as much as he likes Kurt himself. No, I'm not setting up Juggernaut. He's not going to appear in any of my fix videos, but if they went in this direction, they could easily say that Kane survived his apparent death and use something similar to his origin in the comics. But when Marko says his son died, Charles picks up some stray thoughts and sees that Kurt himself is dying. Kurt doesn't deny it. He believes it's something that Essex did to him and the other scientists at the facility. Adler and Mueller are both dead, and I probably got a month left before I die too. Kurt tells Charles Essex always bragged to the other scientists about his special advanced equipment that was all still at Auschwitz. He always talked about how when they got to a certain point in their work, they would have to move their operations there to continue. Charles knows Kurt is telling the truth, so even if Essex isn't at his old stomping grounds, this is at least a lead, which is more than what they had before they came here. Before they leave, Kurt tells Charles when he's dead, the Xavier estate will pass on to Charles. He asks him to forgive him. He explains that he didn't actually kill Brian Xavier, but he had an opportunity to save his colleague, and he chose not to act. He knows it was inexcusable, but he blabbers on about how he tried to make up for it by taking care of Charles and his mother in her final years, and keeping Charles taken care of at the facility before he found out Charles was a mutant. Charles says he has no reason to forgive his stepfather, but he knows that it will do him no good to allow rage to consume his life. He forgives Kurt, and even offers to telepathically turn off the pain receptors in his mind. I don't know if this is something Charles could actually do, but let's roll with it. They part with things more or less cleared between them. Eric chastises Charles for so easily giving in to his sentimentality. He might even say that rage is the only thing he has left that keeps him going. Charles asks, what about brotherhood? I just found out the closest thing I had to a brother before I met you died, and I couldn't even muster a tear, Eric. But you are a brother to me. I believed what I told Marko. You don't have to hold on to your pain. It will only bring you more pain, I promise you. Eric does not respond. They go to Germany. Now, having a secret supervillain based beneath a concentration camp is very tacky, but the movies and the comics already went to connecting Magneto to the Holocaust, and Essex felt this was the best place to hide from Eric because he would never think to come here. Before they go further, Eric has to compose himself. He's nearly in tears. Eric hasn't been here since Essex helped him escape. I had to Google this, but apparently since 1947, Auschwitz has been open to the public, so they won't have any problem sneaking in. Maybe Eric senses a hidden door somewhere, and they go to it. They do some snooping, and they find some technology that Charles suspects Essex used to find mutants to continue his experiments after Eric brought the facility down in America. This will be our precursor to Cerebro, and possibly even Eric building his helmet. They also find some files. In addition to Essex hiding where he knew Eric would never come, they discover he's also had some help from various governments around the world. They are funding him, providing air quotes volunteers for him to continue his work, whatever he needs. Some of these countries are the same ones Eric and Charles were hunting Nazis in earlier in the movie. Places that were all too willing to accept them turning in war criminals for due process, and they are assisting the worst of them. We will get some kind of callback to the conversation Charles and Eric had earlier about how playing by the rules is the best way to handle this sort of thing. Eric will say it's much more difficult to do that when the rules keep changing. Then they find Essex. He's surprised to see them, but not as surprised as they are. He has not aged a day. He looks a little pale, but he looks just as he did the day he escaped Eric's wrath in 1949. He tells them he was successful in implementing special abilities in human subjects, and now that he has accomplished this, he intends to finish what the Third Reich started over a decade earlier. In the comics, they play it like Sinister doesn't really care about the Nazis and is only using them for his own purposes, but he's experimenting on people he sees as less than him, so he's already in the ballpark of the Nazis, so I say just go all the way with it. Before Eric can unleash heck, Essex summons some of his more successful subjects, probably former guards who worked at the camp during the war. They will have powers also, but nothing too fancy. One of them will have telepathy. Not only can we get a cool telepathic battle like what we were supposed to get in First Class between Emma and Charles, but also so Charles isn't able to easily wipe the floor with these guys. The guards will keep Charles and Eric busy while Essex escapes. Eric will be a little more brutal than Charles, though he still doesn't kill any of the guards who get in his way. Maybe he just breaks a few legs. Not because of Charles' good influence, but because he doesn't want to lose Essex again, so he doesn't want to waste time with these guys. Eric will corner Essex, and Essex will try to talk him out of his revenge. You are nothing without me. I see how far you've come, Winsher. You would not be here if I hadn't taken you from here. Eric calmly tells Essex that he has learned a great deal since they last saw each other, and he has his friend to thank for that. He taught me the true path to controlling and exploring these abilities that you sought to exploit, the balance between rage and serenity, and often I choose serenity. It has served me well, but there must be a balance. For that to happen, sometimes I must choose rage. And with that, Eric manipulates the metal stool to become shackles around Essex's feet, and he begins to lift the entire laboratory to the surface. This will serve as our really big oh crap mutants are a real thing moment for the public at large, much like the Cuban Missile Crisis was in First Class. With the installation lifted above ground level, Essex mocks Eric. So you will leave me to the authorities, young Winsher. You saw my files. You know they condone my work. I can offer dozens of nations true power against your kind, against their enemies. Will they really allow me to be put behind bars? You haven't won. Eric turns and begins to walk away. You're right. And as he leaves, dozens of hypodermic needles filled with various samples of mutant abilities lift off the table. They fly towards Essex. Eric finds Charles, who is finally victorious over his telepathic foe. Charles asks Eric what happened to Essex. Eric says he chose death over imprisonment. This is similar to an exchange between them in the X-Men Origins Magneto script, where Charles doubts Eric but doesn't push too hard. Eric says they should get out before the authorities are able to get in. They take the mutant detection equipment with them, mostly thinking they need to keep something like this out of the hands of the next Essex. And with Eric's demonstration of his power, and the various files Essex had that will be impossible to keep out of the public after this, mutants will become a target for those who fear and hate their kind. In the Magneto origin screenplay, there's a young Senator Kelly who cameos, but I did the math on this, and Bruce Davison was only in his mid-50s when the first X-Men movie came out, so if we extrapolate, he would be about 15 during the events of First Class. Much as I love the idea of using Kelly here, it wouldn't work unless this was set sometime in the 80s, and I don't want this going that far in the future just yet. Eric doesn't regret what he did though. Maybe for a second he thought if he exposed Essex to the general public and played things Charles's way, that would have worked. But he knows that he won't be able to continue working towards serenity for very long. We end with Charles and Eric back at the mansion with the bulky equipment they stole from Essex's lab. Eric asks Charles what he plans to do with it now that he has kept it out of enemy hands. Charles shoots him a look for referring to all of humans as the enemy. I'm going to use it. We are going to use it, my friend. There are other mutants out there like we were. Now that they know that they're not the only ones, they need guidance like we did. I want to do something like what Marko, Mueller, Adler, what they were pretending to do for us. I want to offer help to mutants who will need it. Offer help to everyone who needs it. It could take years though. This machine, it's a long way from being operational. Essex knew how to work it. I could barely even turn it on. But we have time. time. I still have my education I'd have to see to before I can turn this place into the school I envision it as, and there's still Essex's network that he was working with, still active, and likely more eager than ever to seek out our kind. I could use help here, Eric. Eric smiles and reaches out his hand towards Charles. And that's it. I'm sure there will be someone who won't like this as much as First Class, and that's understandable. That movie was made by professionals who do this for a living, so it's to be expected. But I like what I have here. It checks off the boxes I was hoping it would, fitting within the framework of the previous X-Men movies, and using what I feel are the best elements of the Sheldon Turner Magneto origin screenplay and the First Class movie that we got. And I think this would offer plenty of room to do more stories set before the first X-Men movie. You've just barely scratched the surface here on the frenemy ship that is Charles and Eric, so you could easily do another movie on down the line, maybe a few movies. That Mystique Cold War movie that I've wanted ever since I listened to the commentary on X2, you could have them cameo there. You could go so far as the mid-1980s with the beginnings of the school when you finally have Eric and Charles go their separate ways. By my math, the professor's original students, Beast, Storm, Jean, and Cyclops, would have all been about 15 in 1985, and I like the idea of Eric still being at the school when these guys first enrolled. I like this one, and I hope you guys did as well. Be sure to force your neighbors to watch this, even if you have to hack into their smart TV to do it, and annihilate that like button like never before. In the meantime, I do other videos, so check those out if you're interested, and check back soon for my fix on another X-Men movie. Until then, I'll be in your dreams.